The Army Air Forces played an important part in winning the war. It is equally important to ensure our winning the peace that America remain what it is today, the leading air power in the world.
February 19th, 1945. 30,000 Marines hit a beach that looks dead, scorched, cratered, silent. Nothing could have survived the Navy's relentless bombardment, or so they thought. Beneath their boots lies a hidden fortress, 11 miles of tunnels, 1,500 rooms, 21,000 soldiers waiting in darkness with one order: to kill as many Americans as possible before dying. How could anyone have expected to survive this? Over 36 days, nearly 7,000 Marines would never leave, and fewer than 1,100 Japanese defenders survived. This is Iwo Jima, the real story, the one Washington didn't want told. A battle that began not with heroism, but with a question no one wanted to answer. Why were men being sent to die on an island the size of a town? The island nobody could ignore. By early 1945, the United States was winning the Pacific War, and everyone knew it. Island by island, battle by battle, the American military had pushed across thousands of miles of ocean. Guadalcanal was taken, Tarawa was taken, Saipan, Tinian, Guam, all in American hands. From those captured islands, the newest and most devastating weapon in the American arsenal was already in the air. The B-29 Superfortress, a long-range heavy bomber capable of reaching the Japanese mainland, was flying missions almost daily, dropping incendiary bombs on Tokyo, Osaka, Nagoya, and dozens of other cities.
It's an insignificant speck in the vastness of the Pacific Ocean. But since it's located halfway between Tokyo and US air bases in the Marianas, Iwo Jima could become a vital support base for B-29 bombers.
The bombing campaign was designed to break Japan's ability to fight. And on paper, it was working. But there was a problem, and the problem had a name: Iwo Jima. This tiny volcanic island, barely 8 square miles, shaped like a pork chop, is sitting almost exactly halfway between the Mariana Islands and mainland Japan, was Japanese territory. It had been under Japanese control since the late 1800s, and by 1945, it had become the single most dangerous piece of real estate in the Pacific for American air crews. Japanese radar stations on Iwo Jima detected incoming B-29 formations hours before they reached their targets. That early warning gave Japan time to scramble fighters and prepare anti-aircraft defenses. Worse, Japanese fighter planes launched directly from Iwo Jima's airfields and intercepted the bombers mid-flight, attacking them over open ocean where there was nowhere to hide and no friendly airfield to limp toward. American planes were being shot down. Others were limping home so badly damaged they crashed on landing.
The 29 veered off the runway and hit 2 parked gas trucks. After hitting the second gas trailer, the plane crossed the taxiway and crashed.
Our crews were dying not over Japan, but over a speck of volcanic rock they'd never heard of. The math was brutal. Every bombing run that passed over Iwo Jima bled American planes and American lives. The United States needed that island for 3 reasons, and all 3 were non-negotiable. First, to destroy the radar stations that warned Japan of every incoming raid. Second, to eliminate the fighter base that was shredding the bomber formations. And third, and this was the reason that would save more lives than any other decision in the Pacific War, to use Iwo Jima's airfields as emergency landing strips for crippled B-29s that couldn't make it home, and as a base for P-51 Mustang escort fighters that could protect the bombers all the way to their targets. Without Iwo Jima, the air war over Japan would continue to hemorrhage men and machines. And with Iwo Jima, the United States could control the sky from the Marianas to Tokyo. There was no alternative. There was no way around the island. It sat directly in the path of the war like a stone in a river, and the river had to go through it. American planners knew taking the island would cost lives. Intelligence estimates suggested the battle might last 5 days, maybe a week. The island was small. The bombardment would be overwhelming. Japanese resistance would be fierce but short. They were wrong about almost everything, because while American admirals were calculating how many shells it would take to flatten Iwo Jima's surface, a Japanese general was already underground, building something those admirals couldn't see and hadn't imagined: Is something that would turn 5 days into 36 and a quick victory into a nightmare that haunted survivors for the rest of their lives. The general who built a grave. His name was Tadamichi Kuribayashi, and the cruelest truth about him is that he was not a monster. He was a poet, a letter writer, a father who drew little cartoons for his children because they were too young to read his words. The fifth generation of a samurai family, Kuribayashi had served 6 emperors before the war. As a young man, he hadn't even wanted to be a soldier. He dreamed of becoming a journalist. Brilliant, rebellious, human, and Japan sent him to a volcanic island in the middle of the Pacific to build a grave for 21,000 men, including himself. Before the war, he had lived in the United States. Not as a spy, and not as a casual visitor, he trained with the American cavalry at Fort Bliss, Texas, bought a car, drove across the country, and shook hands with the men he would soon face in combat. He saw Detroit's factory floors, the raw industrial power America could unleash at a moment's notice, and he understood it. He feared it. In a letter to his wife, Yoshi, he wrote, "The United States is the last country in the world Japan should fight. Its industrial potential is huge and fabulous, and the people are energetic and versatile. One must never underestimate the American fighting ability." He had seen it firsthand. He knew what his country was up against. In May 1944, Prime Minister Hideki Tojo personally selected Kuribayashi to defend Iwo Jima. It was framed as an honor, but historians believe it may have been a death sentence in disguise. Kuribayashi had openly argued that Japan's war against America was unwinnable, that negotiations were the only path to survival. To Tokyo's ultra-nationalists, that made him a defeatist. Sending him to a doomed island was perhaps a convenient way to silence an inconvenient voice. On the morning he left, Yoshi served him his favorite meal, herring wrapped in seaweed and red bean rice. He looked at her calmly and said that even his ashes probably wouldn't make it home. She didn't take him seriously. Too calm. Before he boarded the plane, Emperor Hirohito granted him a rare audience, a personal honor, yet in the letter Kuribayashi wrote afterward, he didn't mention it. He wrote instead about the draft in the kitchen he never fixed, a mundane regret that haunted him even on the eve of a suicide mission. He landed on Iwo Jima on June 19th. In 1944, trenches already scarred the beaches, but Kuribayashi stunned his officers by issuing a radical order: abandon the shoreline defenses, stop fortifying the beaches, move everything underground. Tokyo demanded the traditional strategy: guns facing the ocean, trenches in the sand, a wall of fire to repel the Americans. Kuribayashi rejected it entirely. He had studied the failure of those tactics on other islands. A gun facing the ocean would be destroyed before a single Marine got wet. He refused to waste men on what history had already condemned. What followed was almost unimaginable. Over 8 months, Kuribayashi oversaw the construction of 11 miles of tunnels, 5,000 fortified positions, and deep underground passageways that plunged as far as 90 feet. Deeper than a 7-story building. Conditions were hellish. Temperatures soared to 120 degrees. Sulfur fumes choked the men. Fresh water was scarce. Dysentery claimed lives even before the Americans arrived. Kuribayashi ate what his men ate, endured the same heat and fumes, visited wounded soldiers in field hospitals, and earned not just respect, but deep loyalty. He issued 6 courageous battle vows, the most crucial of which demanded that every soldier kill at least 10 Americans before dying. Not to hold the island, Kuribayashi knew the island would fall, but to make the cost so staggering that it might give Tokyo pause before attacking the Japanese mainland. And then he defied tradition again. He banned banzai charges. Across the Pacific, Japanese forces had repeatedly ended battles with mass frontal assaults, soldiers charging machine guns in the name of honor. Kuribayashi considered it wasteful and ineffective. His men would stay hidden, fire only when success was certain, withdraw into tunnels, reappear unpredictably, and make the Americans pay for every inch. By February 11, 1945, construction was complete.
1945, the Pacific War was over. Japan surrendered unconditionally, simply by pressure from a distance. That pressure was air power.
8 days later, the Americans would arrive. From above, the island appeared destroyed, cratered, scorched, empty, exactly as Kuribayashi intended. Confidence in the Marines would be their undoing. Beneath the black sand, the tunnels waited. Inside, Kuribayashi waited. The man who had drawn cartoons for his children, who worried about a broken kitchen draft, had built the most sophisticated defensive network the Americans had ever faced. He carried the Colt pistol given to him by a friend in Texas, the same weapon he may have used to end his own life when the battle was lost. Kuribayashi's genius lay not in cruelty, but in understanding. He understood the Americans. He understood the value of patience. He understood sacrifice. And he understood that leadership sometimes meant placing the lives of men into a machine far larger than themselves, into a strategy that would make them icons in history, even as they vanished into ash and tunnels. He was brilliant, humane, and terrifying in equal measure, a man tasked with orchestrating one of the deadliest battles of the Pacific, fully aware that he would not survive it himself. On Iwo Jima, the line between hero and strategist, father and general, human and machine blurred. Kuribayashi was all of it, and when the Marines stepped onto the black volcanic sand, confident that nothing could have survived, they were stepping directly into the world he had painstakingly built, a world of hidden death, patience, precision, and inevitability. 36 days in the black sand. The first Marines hit the beach at 8:59 on the morning of February 19, 1945.
By the time US Marines landed on Iwo Jima on the 19th of February 1945, Kuribayashi's forces had dug 11 miles of defense tunnels out of a planned 17.
And for the first several minutes, they felt relief. The beach was silent. No machine gun fire, no mortar rounds, no screaming counterattacks. Just black volcanic ash that sucked at their boots and slowed every step, and an eerie, impossible quiet that didn't match anything their training had prepared them for. They pushed forward. Thousands of men poured off the landing craft. Tanks rolled onto the sand and immediately bogged down in the soft ash. Equipment piled up. The beach grew crowded. Men started to wonder if maybe the bombardment really had worked. Maybe the intelligence was right. Or maybe this would be 5 days. Then Kuribayashi gave the order. The island erupted, not from one direction, from everywhere. Artillery shells screamed in from hidden positions inland. Mortars dropped with terrifying precision onto beaches that had been measured, mapped, and zeroed weeks in advance. Machine gun fire tore across the sand from concrete bunkers that were supposed to have been destroyed. Every shell was aimed. Every burst was calculated. The Japanese hadn't been firing because they'd been waiting. Waiting for the beach to fill with men, waiting for the landing craft to pack in tight, waiting for the moment when maximum damage could be inflicted with minimum waste. Within minutes, the beach became a killing field. Men who had been walking upright were face down in the ash, and medics who ran toward the wounded were cut down before they arrived. Tanks that had bogged down became coffins. The black sand, which had seemed like nothing more than an inconvenience, turned red. Marines couldn't dig foxholes because the ash collapsed in on itself. There was no cover, no retreat. The landing craft behind them was still coming. The guns ahead of them weren't stopping. And then the real nightmare began. Mount Suribachi, the volcanic cone at the southern tip of the island, came alive with fire. Guns hidden inside the mountain itself poured rounds down onto the beaches from an elevated position that couldn't be flanked. Marines were being hit from the front, from the flanks, and from above simultaneously. Men who tried to crawl forward were hit. Men who stayed still were hit. Men who tried to go back toward the water were hit. There was no safe direction. Over the next several days, the Marines pushed inland toward the airfields and the high ground, and every single yard was paid for. Every ridge was defended. Every slope concealed guns. Bunkers that were cleared in the morning fired again at night, because the tunnels allowed Japanese soldiers to reoccupy positions that the Marines believed they'd already taken. Ground that was won was lost and won again. The same hill might change hands 3 or 4 times in a single day. Marines began to understand that they weren't fighting an enemy on the surface. They were fighting an enemy underneath it. On February 23rd, 4 days into the battle, Marines raised the American flag on top of Mount Suribachi.
In 1945, U.S. Marines raised the American flag atop Mount Suribachi.
At that moment, captured in one of the most famous photographs in history, became the enduring image of Iwo Jima. It looked like victory. It felt like a turning point. It was neither. The flag went up on the 4th day. The battle lasted 36. When those Marines planted that flag, the worst of the fighting hadn't even started. The central and northern defenses were still intact. The tunnel network was still operational. The killing was just beginning. By early March, American commanders tried sending men into the tunnels. The losses were immediate and devastating. These weren't caves. They were interconnected systems designed for defense in depth. A Marine who entered a tunnel found himself in total darkness, moving through narrow passages where fire could come from any direction. Ahead, behind, from junctions he couldn't see. And grenades rolled silently through openings and detonated at his feet. Machine guns appeared from positions that hadn't existed seconds before. Men who went in didn't always come out. Within days, commanders abandoned the strategy. Entering the tunnels was a death sentence. Instead, they adopted a method that was slower but survivable. Infantry and tanks worked in teams. M4 Sherman flamethrower tanks, the Marines called them Zippos, rolled forward under covering fire and blasted streams of liquid flame directly into tunnel entrances. The fire consumed oxygen, drove unbearable heat deep inside, and forced anyone near the entrance to retreat or burn. Then came demolitions. Grenades, satchel charges, and finally bulldozers, collapsing entrances, sealing passageways, burying sections of the network permanently. It was slow work. Neutralizing a single position could take an entire day, sometimes longer, but it worked. By mid-March, the Japanese defense began to fracture.
I saw the carnage and the complete devastation that I'd never seen before. It was a total carnage. There was nothing left standing.
Not because the soldiers surrendered, but because the tunnels themselves were being destroyed around them. Communication lines between positions broke down, supplies ran out. Wounded soldiers lay in darkness without treatment, without water, without hope. The fortress Kuribayashi had built was being sealed shut, room by room, passage by passage, and still nobody surrendered. The island that never stopped fighting. On March 26, 1945, the United States officially declared Iwo Jima secured.
World War II in the Pacific, 4 years of bloody hell, came to an end here. September 2nd, 1945, a solemn ceremony on the deck of the USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay.
But the word secured meant something very specific and very incomplete. It meant organized resistance had ended. It did not mean the fighting was over. It did not mean it was safe. And it absolutely did not mean the Japanese had given up. At the time of that declaration, American intelligence estimated that nearly 3,000 Japanese soldiers were still alive somewhere on or beneath the island. 3,000 men in tunnels, in sealed chambers, in pockets of resistance that hadn't been found yet. The battle was over on paper. On the ground, it was still happening. The most violent proof came the night before the island was declared secure. On the night of March 25th, roughly 300 Japanese soldiers emerged silently from a fortified ravine the Americans called the Gorge. This was not a banzai charge. There were no battle cries, no fixed bayonets glinting in moonlight, no running headlong into gun emplacements. They moved like ghosts. Using knives and small arms, they infiltrated the area around Airfield No. 2 and attacked sleeping American troops inside their tents. More than 100 Americans were killed or wounded before the assault was stopped. Men who had survived 35 days of the bloodiest combat in the Pacific were murdered in their sleep on the night before the battle was officially declared over. It was the last organized Japanese attack on Iwo Jima, and it was one of the deadliest. General Kuribayashi is believed to have died during or shortly after this final action. His body was never recovered. In his last known order, he told his remaining men to fight to the end. And then he did something remarkable and chilling. He removed his rank insignia, picked up a weapon, and fought as a common soldier. not as a general directing men from a command post, as a man in the dirt, anonymous, unidentifiable even in death. He ensured that the Americans would never find his body, never photograph it, never parade it as a trophy. He disappeared into the battle he'd designed, and the island swallowed him the way it swallowed everything. But even Kuribayashi's death didn't end what he'd started. For weeks after the official declaration, American forces continued to encounter resistance. Japanese soldiers emerged from tunnels at night, starving, wounded, half-mad from darkness and heat and sulfur fumes, and attacked American positions. Some were looking for food, some were carrying out Kuribayashi's last orders. Some had simply been underground so long they didn't know the battle was supposed to be over. Rather than risk more lives by sending men back into the tunnels, American forces sealed them. E-bulldozers collapsed entrances, explosives buried passageways under tons of rock. Entire sections of the underground network were entombed, often with Japanese soldiers still alive inside. Men who had fought for weeks, who had survived the bombardment and the flamethrowers and the demolitions, were sealed in darkness beneath the earth. Some died quickly, some did not. In 1984, 39 years after the battle ended, a former naval hospital tunnel on Iwo Jima was accidentally reopened during construction work. Inside, workers found the mummified remains of 54 Japanese soldiers. They were exactly where they had fallen. Some were still clutching medical supplies, others held sack bottles. The tunnel had been sealed shut in 1945 and never opened since.
Trash and stuff in here, is that stuff that was untampered with, or is that shit that people have left in here since 1945?
Those men had been entombed for nearly 4 decades, frozen in the moment of their death, preserved by the volcanic heat and the airless darkness of the tunnels they had carved with their own hands. And the holdouts. This is the part that sounds like fiction, but is documented fact. Japanese soldiers continued to emerge from the tunnels of Iwo Jima for years after the war ended. Not months, years, startling American personnel who had long since stopped expecting contact. The final known surrender didn't come until January 6, 1949, nearly 4 years after Japan's formal capitulation. 2 machine gunners, Yamakage Kufuku and Matsudo Linsoki, walked out of the caves and surrendered to stunned American soldiers. They had survived by hiding deep underground during daylight hours and emerging at night to steal food and water from American supply dumps. When they surrendered, they were described as clean and well-fed. Proof that beneath an island the Americans believed they controlled completely, an underground war had been continuing in silence for 4 years. 4 years of darkness, 4 years of stealing food at night and hiding before sunrise. 4 years of not knowing, or not accepting, that the war they were fighting had ended long ago. The final numbers tell a story that doesn't need embellishment. Nearly 6,800 Americans were killed on Iwo Jima. Total American casualties exceeded 26,000, wounded, killed and missing. On an island you could drive across in 10 minutes. Of the roughly 21,000 Japanese defenders, fewer than 1,100 survived. The rest died in the tunnels, on the surface, in the ash, or were sealed underground and never found. In 2010, researchers used wartime American maps to locate mass graves near Mount Suribachi, containing the remains of an estimated 2,200 soldiers. As of today, more than 12,000 Japanese remains have never been recovered. They are still there, still inside the island, still in the tunnels and chambers and sealed rooms that Kuribayashi built to be their fortress, and that became, in the end, their tomb. Iwo Jima didn't end when the guns fell silent. The island still holds its secrets, the tunnels still whisper with the weight of lives lost, and the men who survived carried the darkness with them for decades. History remembers the strategy, the maps, the flag atop the mountain. But what about the ground beneath their boots, the ash that swallowed men whole, the choices that no one can ever unmake? The story isn't over, and because the island itself still waits. And the question remains, how do you reckon with a place where the dead outnumber the living and the truth refuses to be contained?